Soon after Brezhnev came to power, the policies of thaw were abandoned, to be replaced with a cult of the Great Patriotic War. Stalin was rehabilitated in a limited way, mentioned as part of the story of Soviet growth and victory in World War II, but not glorified. Ideological dissenters were persecuted, as in the 1965 trial of two writers, Sinyavsky and Daniel, who had published abroad works that were censored in the Soviet Union. They were sentenced to prison amid public protests. Czech socialists rose up in the Prague Spring of 1968 and were suppressed by tanks sent from Moscow to prop up the local regime. Human rights activists in the Soviet bloc were also harassed. But overall, the scale of dissent was small, involving relatively isolated intellectuals without broad social support. The overwhelming majority of dissidents were actually pro-Soviet. They wanted to reform the Soviet system but leave its foundations untouched. Rather than another revolution, they hoped to hold the regime accountable to its official promises of justice and liberation. These protests were nonviolent and insisted on observing existing state law. They varied ideologically, with some emphasizing communism, others Western liberalism, and still others nationalist themes, Russian or other. Finally, there was religious dissent, including non-conforming Orthodox believers and other confessions or sects. Dissidents were punished with imprisonment, forced commitment to psychiatric wards, and, for the most famous cultural figures, forced emigration from the USSR. Joseph Brodsky emigrated in 1972, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn published The Gulag Archipelago abroad in 1973 and emigrated in 1974. Andrei Sakharov, 1921 to 1989, a nuclear physicist who became a human rights activist, was sentenced to internal exile from 1980 until 1986, when he was allowed to return to his home in Moscow. Brezhnev created good working relationships with Western leaders, with the intention of preventing another Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soyuz Apollo joint space mission, beginning in 1967, reduced the antagonism of the space race, and a series of agreements in the 1970s reduced the risk of a major nuclear war. These included the Soviet West German Treaty of 1970, the ABM and SALT-1 disarmament treaties of 1972, President Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972, Brezhnev's visit to the United States in 1973, the Helsinki agreements confirming European borders, economic cooperation, and human rights pledges, and the SALT-2 disarmament treaty signed in Vienna.